Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey.
Welcome to the Home Education Matters podcast, the podcast that answers all your home education questions. So I'm Diane Wills and I'm a home educating parent, and I'm here with Eleanor today, who's the host of the podcast, and we've also got Tara with us today. Tara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, morning, and thanks for having me. Yeah, my name's Tara. I'm a parent of a nearly 20-year-old neurodivergent young man who's amazing, and we are a neurodivergent family or neurodiverse family. For my day job, I'm a lecturer and a researcher in autism, and I also run the parent carer or co-chair the Parent Carer Forum in Plymouth, and I have a parent support group, part of the NAS for the Plymouth branch. So I'm sort of pretty much immersed in the community, the autism community, for most of my waking hours. Yeah, and it's great.
Yeah, so you're pretty busy then. And I'm also the parent of a home educated neurodiverse child, as we kind of notice that neurodiversity tends to be peppered through the family. So I think all of my family are pretty neurodiverse, but I have one child who's got a diagnosis.
This leads me on to an interesting little segue, right? That happens right at the start, which is an unusual one. But do you think that the increase in diagnoses of neurodivergent conditions is because we are now more aware of it and our diagnosing is better, or is it that for some reason there's an increase in it?
Research actually doesn't know, and it's one of the main questions of my sort of day-to-day research that I do at the university is what is driving this hike in in diagnoses of autism, and I was interested because it was something when I was I was at school in the 80s, giving away my age here, but and we never heard of it. From that perspective, I look back and I reflect on my education, and actually it was there. It was always there, except we had huts lined up in our school, lots and lots of huts, sort of separate from the rest of the main building. And these huts were called, and I hate it, it still fills me with horror when I think about it, they were called remedial classes. Mm-hmm. And I think back and I think how many of those children were autistic but undiagnosed, or had ADHD but didn't know. And as a child who was in one of those classes for some time and spent most of her education outside the headmaster's office, I can really empathize with sort of why people want a diagnosis now. They want understanding. They want people to to be able to take another's perspective. So I think the answer is it's always there. We've always, if it wasn't for autistic people, we'd all still be living in caves. I absolutely firmly believe that. Yeah, I think it's always there. I just think we're more aware now. However, that said, when we do the statistics in research, that doesn't always play out. There does seem to be an increase in neurodivergence in the number of young people who are being born neurodivergent. So who knows? Maybe we'll get an answer soon. But because we actually don't have the etiology of autism, it's very difficult to actually give a conclusive answer. And so I think we will continue to speculate, I think, for a while, and the research needs to continue in that area.
Okay, so I've got a number of questions, but I'm gonna get into them later, because to begin with, I'd like to just sort of get a handle on, as somebody from a neurotypical family, if I was home educating, and it's difficult when you're out of the system, because if you're in the system and your child is in school, invariably teachers play a role in picking up these kind of things. But if you assume that I'm a home educating parent and one of my children, I think, is autistic or may possibly be autistic, firstly, what is it? And secondly, what sort of things can we look out for as home educating parents?
Okay, so what is autism is dependent on your own perspective. So if I was to give you a clinical answer, I would reach to my bookcase and pull out the DSM-5 or the ICD, and I would read you a list of basically deficits, which I won't do because I find it abhorrent.
Sorry to interrupt. So this is ways in which they would compare a neurodivergent child with a neurotypical child and say they're not able to do this, they're not. So it's more like a kind of like Simone de Beauvoir would say, when you say what a woman is based on how she's not a man, it's the same thing with a neurodivergent child, is what they are because they're diverging from a norm.
They're diverging from what is neuronormative. Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, in our society, that anything that diverges from the norm tends to be held up as being, how do I say this tactfully? Actually, I don't need to be tactful because it's the responsibility of the non-autistic population that this happens. It tends to be looked at in a negative light, and it need not be. Like I said before, I think we'd all still be living in caves if it wasn't for neurodivergence. We certainly wouldn't have won the Second World War. We'd all be, if it wasn't for Alan Turing, who was notably autistic. So, all of these things, we can look back in history and say that it's actually a positive thing in a lot of ways. But if you want to know what autism is, you would clinically look at a manual. And a manual would say that there was a deficit in reciprocal communication and forming and maintaining relationships, would be a deficit in, note the word deficit, which is said all the time. It's not a strengths-based document. There would be a deficit in terms of interests, so it would be restrictive and repetitive behaviors. So those are two what they call axes of there's that communication and then those restricted interests. If you are neurotypical, your restricted interests are normally called passions or pursuits. So you can see the double standard that sits in when you add a medical label to it. So that's medically what autism is. So this difficulty with communication. If you're ever interested in a more balanced view, you could look up Damien Milton, who is the writer of what they call the double empathy problem. He sort of describes autism, and he's an autistic professor, brilliant man. I saw him speak at the 2018 Autistica conference, and he was so eloquent when he explained this, far more eloquent than I can be. But he explained that, double empathy is this position where, you have two different minds, both misunderstanding each other. It is not a case that autism does not understand, neurotypicality. It's that neurotypicality does not understand autism. So there is a double-edged sword here. And this was evidenced by a brilliant woman at Edinburgh University called Catherine Crompton, who did this fantastic study. And I wish I thought of it. She did this research and engaged this group of people in something called a diffusion chain. So she got this group of people who were autistic and this group of people who were non-autistic. And she put them together in three groups: a group of autistic people, a group of non-autistic people, and a mixed group. And she measured their ability to navigate this diffusion chain, which is a chain of information passed from one to the other. We would know it incorrectly as Chinese whispers. And she measured them on two axes: their accuracy of information transmission and the rapport they had with their colleagues. Well, lo and behold, the non-autistic people did very, very well in their information transmission. They not a problem at all. They were very high accuracy, and they reported a good level of rapport. And then she went to the autistic group. Now, they were slightly more accurate, and that's not a surprise. And they also reported a high level of rapport. But when she went to the mixed group, the accuracy fell, diminished, and the rapport was not great. So what you've got here is not a case of can't communicate, but a difference in communication. And I think we need to remember that when we talk about autism and autistic people.
Is there an element of arguing that if I don't know what percentage of the population are autistic, but I'm guessing it's reasonably low. So is there an argument that if the vast majority, like 90% of people, are all communicating on one kind of radio wavelength, that the onus is on the minority, if they want to be understood, to also communicate on that one? Or is the flip argument that actually, as a majority, it is our sort of duty to make sure that everyone is included?
Yeah. So the last word that you used is the key. There is inclusion. So, there's an old adage that a society is judged on how it treats its most vulnerable members. And when you other a group of people, when you start othering people, you inherently make them make them vulnerable. Because you're denying them the same opportunities as if you like the majority have, and that can apply to not just autistic people, but it can apply to race, it can apply to sex, it can gender, all sorts of things. So when we apply this critically and we think about it, there is actually so much othering going on in society. And when you look at the group of people that are supposedly neurotypical, and then you take out all of the other aspects, maybe they're old, like me. I suddenly realised I became invisible at 50, and it was quite a shock. They might be female, they might identify as female. They might identify as trans. They might, there might be, and they might be homeless. They might be, chronically disabled in other ways. When you start pulling out all of these things, actually what you're left with is a lot of very minority groups. And actually it pushes what would be what you're describing as the neurotypical person into a minority group. Because we all have our own, things going on. So in order to be fully inclusive, we've got to change our mindset. And we've always expected autistic people to come to us, to make the effort. So not only have they got to navigate a world that isn't built for them, not only have they got to communicate in a way that is often painful, not only are they expected to change their authentic selves in order to be accepted, but we make them do all the work as well. And we still expect them to hit targets. Oh, they're not achieving at school. Oh, they're not doing this. If a child's trying to navigate an environment in school, that is all they can do half the time, because it is so overwhelming, because school is not built for the autistic child. So for me, no. The onus is on those who have capacity, the spare capacity, the excess capacity, who have the easier ride to make some of the adjustments and the changes. It's a bit like us as English speakers. There's so few of us who speak a second language. I don't speak a second language, and I berate myself for it because it's lazy, and I should speak another language. But I'm English, so everywhere you go, you can pretty much be understood, and it's wrong. It's a privilege we need to let go of. So no, and that's a very long answer. Sorry, Eleanor. To what should we be doing? I get a bit on my soapbox with these things because the injustice of it reaches the core of me, and I find it very difficult sometimes to keep a lid on that. So to anybody who's listening, sorry for the rant.
No, I empathise.
Yeah.
As a card-carrying feminist, I regularly get on rants about otherness. So yeah, that's fine. I completely agree with you on that one. When it comes to getting a sense of diagnosis. So I'm not talking about formal diagnosis. I'm talking about that kind of pre-diagnosis that as a parent you might do. For example, my daughter is dyslexic and she's been home educated all the way through. And so when she was about 6 or 7, she could read really well, but her writing was pretty awful. And sometimes she put the letters back to front. And I just was like, is this dyslexia? Like, is it because my knowledge of dyslexia was that it was all about reading? Her reading was like extremely good. And anyway, I did like my own kind of little kind of sense of what was happening. I gave her little bits of writing to do, and then I went and got her formally diagnosed. So what sort of things can a parent look out for if they suspect their child might be autistic, and would just like to explore that as a possibility?
So I think the first thing to say is every single child is different. There are different presentations of autism, and Dr. Stephen Shaw was quite clear when he said, when you've met one person, he says with autism, but one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I like to change it because it's, and he's right. He's absolutely right. And Stephen Shaw is autistic himself. So I think when you're looking for classic signs, there can be different things. So there can be communication differences, an absence of pointing, waving, something we call referencing. So referencing is that thing where a child's trying to get your attention and they might look at you and then or you might try and get the child's attention, say, oh, look at that. And they'll look at you and see where you're looking. And you might point and they follow your point. So they're looking at your eyes to see where you're looking. That's that kind of referencing. Maybe a lack of joint attention, which that feeds into, so that sort of reciprocal feedback. I look at something, they look at something, and then they look at you, and there's anticipation. You can see that very often, quite in very early childhood, and that can often be missing, but it can often be there, and it's very difficult. And that doesn't mean to say there is autism or there isn't autism. It's very, very difficult. It tends to be a constellation. I prefer to use the term, a constellation of things that might pique your curiosity around. Oh, could this be a neurodivergent, situation? Now, on my own experience and the children that I've worked with and my own family, there was great joint attention. There was great speech. The classic one is the phone rings or the doorbell goes, and the child immediately in what they call typical development, the child will immediately look to mum or dad or whoever the primary caregiver is, because that's their person of safety. And they will look, and then they will see what the reaction is on the parent's face. Does the parent look scared? Does the parent look happy? Is the parent surprised? And that child takes its emotional cue from the reaction of the parent. Sometimes that can be missing. For us, it wasn't. So those are some of the things. The other thing that you might have is things like language development. Now that's quite an interesting one. All children go through an echoic phase where they echo back words that words that have been said to them. That tends to fade, and then more sort of developed language comes through, and reciprocal language comes through. Echolalia in autism can actually extend. It also does dissipate after a while, but and it can, and on the flip side, it actually can stay forever. But the point being, and speech and language can be very good with helping with that. Pronoun reversal is quite a common thing, in language. You say, okay, they'll say, can you, and they're talking about themselves. So things like that can be, in terms of language development, can be quite a key indicator. Non-verbal cues like pointing, waving, joint attention, that kind of thing, that's quite common. And this is all classic signs. They can and can't be present. That's the difficulty. The other thing to bear in mind is girls tend to present differently. Very often girls are not diagnosed until high school. And that's largely because girls are incredible mimickers, which actually looks like typical development. And maybe it is a little bit. But what happens is when girls reach high school, non-autistic girls, you will see, will take a particular trajectory. They go in one direction very quickly. Socially and emotionally, they change. Whereas autistic girls tend not to follow that pathway, and actually follow a little bit more of a sort of like where the boys are, which is kind of less, is that less sudden change. And that tends to be when the wheels fall off. And that tends to be the danger point for autistic girls in terms of their mental health. Girls are often diagnosed with many things before they're actually diagnosed as autistic, and that is incredibly damaging. So I think, we need to improve our understanding of the female perspective of autism. But going back to what you were saying in terms of sort of classic signs, things that people forget that along with autism comes physiological differences. So a lot of children who are autistic also have gut issues. There can be difficulties around choice of food, eating foods and then suddenly refusing. So if you get something called, some clinicians, and I don't like this term, called regressive autism, children who meet their milestones until the age of about 2 and then suddenly stop talking, stop referencing, joint attention wanes, that kind of thing, language is lost. That can be obviously a big sign that the brain is, because our brain undergoes a huge change at around 2 years of age. We go through a massive amount of what they call neural pruning. So where pathways are set down and they're altered, and things are lost and things are gained, and it's a very complicated. We could spend hours just talking about that one phase of development. But it's an interesting time, and that tends to be if you're going to see a structure, sort of a brain structural change. That may be an indicator in some of the more obvious signs. Another thing will be perhaps things like low muscle tone. Children who are autistic sometimes, not always, but especially those who are not climbers and who perhaps not more physical, might have difficulty with muscle tone, especially core muscle tone, crossing the midline, that kind of thing. All things we look for in physical development. The other thing is toe walking, which is quite common. But I know plenty of non-autistic children who toe walked for a long time. So it is, you can't look at just one or two things and say, oh, look, my child is, you can either be excited or worried about it, whichever way you want to look at it. My child is neurodivergent. You don't know. We absolutely don't know. It's a case of a lot of the pieces of the puzzle have to come together before a diagnosis is made. And a lot of people don't really need a diagnosis because their child is just unique as they are, and they're happy with that. But if you want to pursue that, then those are the sorts of things that clinicians would look for. So there's lots more, but I'm going on a bit now, so I'll shut up.
Well, I just wondered about so some of my experiences with Rosa, and we didn't even know anything about autism when she was quite little. We noticed that she was quite different, and some of the things we noticed were so like she would play with other children, but she would play beside this other child, so it looked from a distance like she was playing with another child, but actually when you kind of got close, what she was doing was just doing her own thing, sitting next to another child. So there wasn't that kind of interactive kind of process, although she plays with her sisters.
I thought all children did that. Children did that, because I thought that was called parallel play, and that's just like a part of development in children.
I think probably Rosa just did it for a bit longer, maybe.
You're
She's still doing it.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess the other things we kind of noticed were all and again, lots of children do this, but we kind of just noticed it more with Rosa. The transitional kind of phases of life were really difficult for her. So getting out of the house, getting into the car, getting out of the car, coming out of, those transitional points were really, really difficult for her. And she had what I think would be described clinically as pathological demand avoidance. So she would really not be happy when we asked her to do things. And she was a runner. She would run. She would run away and scream. And we had a few kind of scary moments where we kind of were worried about her safety. And then when she was at school, we had the typical kind of what I would call fizzy bottle kind of effect. So she'd come out of school, she'd have been fine in school all day. We wouldn't even really get to the car before she completely kind of exploded, because she'd been holding it in all day. The other thing I kind of realised, I suppose, and again, this is not necessarily just an autistic kind of experience, but so I'd always taken my children to the theatre, for instance, children's performances. I remember taking her and we talked about it afterwards, and she'd gone with her siblings, and her siblings had understood the story, had understood the narrative. I realised when I spoke to Rosa, she had made absolutely no sense of this narrative. And that happened quite a lot. But yeah, otherwise, I don't think you would never have realised that she was an autistic child, because she was so skillful, such a skillful child at kind of masking and trying to fit in. I think, as you say, Tara, it's slightly more obvious now. She's in her teenage years, because she isn't following that typical girl, trajectory of doing all the girl stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've listed there so many things. I'll sort of come back to each one if you'd like me to. But I mean, what I was talking about was probably sub 2, very early development, and you've actually talked about something as they get older, which is absolutely vital. I mean, that parallel play you referred to, Eleanor, is a common thing. It does happen. It is a stage of development. That's how we learn how to model from other people, model from other children. But you're right, Diane, it's when you do it for a lot longer, the interactions get more sophisticated with children in a non-autistic way, whereas autistic children equally crave interactions that are more sophisticated, but in their way, on their terms. And when that is not met by understanding and an understanding of what's important to that child, what happens is you just see the other child step away. It's not a case of autistic children isolating themselves, but more a case of autistic children being isolated, because non-autistic children, neurotypical children, don't necessarily understand again, we're back to a clash of understanding. It's not a case of autistic children can't do this. A lot of the time it's because that's not what they value. That's not what's important to them.
Yeah, I was also thinking, I think there is something about the interaction, because what I've also always noticed about Rosa and some other children that I know who are diagnosed as autistic is a bit of hypercriticality of others. And Rosa is hypercritical of her sisters and other children, because as far as Rosa's concerned, they're not doing things right. They're not doing things in the right way. And so, if we've learned some of those social cues, we kind of, we might think these things, but we kind of learn to just back off a little bit, don't we? And not to express that criticality, where Rosa hasn't learned how to do that. So she will continue to make very critical comments of others, and that's something that I've noticed is quite common as well. And I think other children back off sometimes.
I wonder if that's possibly where this idea that autistic children lack empathy comes from. The fact that there's almost like kind of not a filter, because I know quite a few autistic children, and I relish their company because it's really nice to have people who just tell you what it is, like, all the time. But I wonder whether that's partly where this idea has come, that they don't have empathy or they have low empathy because they say things that are hurtful.
We're very sensitive beings, humans, aren't we? We don't take criticism very well, but autistic people are generally truth sayers. I remember as a young woman being told repeatedly that I was a bit too blunt. Those were the words that were used. And many suggestions of why don't you think about what you're going to say before it comes out of your mouth. And it's really difficult because that kind of inhibition requires extra layers of processing, and it's not necessarily, it's tiring. It's really tiring. It's far easier to be a truth sayer, and I find autistic people generally are truth sayers. And the reason why that perhaps they're more critical, or and criticize more often, is largely around, if you talk to a lot of autistic people who are quite vocal about the autistic perspective, they will tell you that they feel very strongly about social justice, equity, and that might come across as perhaps being a bit rule governed. So I think back to when my son was younger, and he used to line a lot of things up. And he would line his cars up, he would line his blocks up, and he'd put things in order, in colour order or whatever. It was incredibly skilled, I have to say, the ability to visualise subtle differences in things and then be able to, map it across like a spectrum of colour, or to build a tower taller than he was out of little wooden blocks by the age of 18 months. We actually only expect him to build about 7 or 8 high at that point. He was building them up, way above his head, and watching them balance and looking at the way the gravity was moving and he was only, less than 2 years old. And the skill that took, we dismiss as being wrong. But actually, that ability, that attention to detail, is an innate strength that we often overlook because it does not meet our normed expectations. And what we do is we quash it. Now, when we run out of structural engineers or people who can see things in detail, we will look to the autistic community to fill that gap. And for me, I think we need to look at children on a strengths basis, and look at what they can do rather than what they can't do. And if they can't do something, or don't want to do something, or don't like doing something, why are we forcing them to do it? I think what you're saying, in terms of development, yes, their development looks different because they bring different strengths. I mean, I'll go back briefly to your transitions. I mean, I've met several children who have extreme difficulty with transitions, right down to things like passing thresholds. So I've worked with young children who struggle to go through a door. Now, you and I might look at each other and go, okay, I really don't understand that. What is the problem? Well, the problem is what's on the other side is not known. It's unpredictable. We don't know. You and I don't know what's through a door. We know what's going to greet us. I mean, it could just be our home, or it could be a mad axeman on the other side of the door. We don't know. Well, if you feel the anxiety of that not knowing every time you pass through a door, imagine what your day is like. It's exhausting. No wonder children have meltdowns. I think, you mentioned the Coke bottle effect. Well, if you imagine all of these things impacting on a child throughout the day, especially children of school age, their safe place is home. Their safe people are their parents or their caregivers. You are their anchor point. And I remember picking my son up from school, and I've written about this in several papers and things. And I would get to him, and he would see me, and he would physically melt into a puddle. He would cry, he would throw himself on the floor, he would just absolutely break down. And I had about 3 weeks of this, and I'm thinking, this is, this something's not right at school here. I mean, we already knew he was autistic, but he was diagnosed very, very early. But, why was he so emotionally upset when he saw me? It wasn't me, because he would then cling to me and he wouldn't let go, and he'd remain subdued for a long time, and he would ask if it was school the next day, and if it wasn't, he'd pick up. But if it was school, he would not. And something had to change. And that's what we call the Coke bottle effect, where they hold it in all day and then they see the person that they're most safe with, and it all comes out because it's relief. It's pure relief. So I think, when we see children who impact that, we need to look at the environment they've just spent all their time in, not the person that they've cried in front of, which tends to be the finger pointing bit.
You mentioned that when they go to school, it's just this kind of cumulative overwhelm that then explodes when they are back at home in their safe environment. And do you think that is because they've spent the whole time at school trying to appear to be normative in some way? And if that is the case, you're nodding, so okay. So if that is the case, is there an argument to say that you need to teach autistic children strategies for them to be able to manage how they interact with the wider world when they get older, because no matter how much we may want to change the world, it's not going to change the world within the next 10 years. Although actually, I mean, things change very quickly, but realistically, there's going to be an element where they are going to find this overwhelm on a regular basis when they get older. Is there a point at which you want to equip them with skills to be able to handle the outside world? Or is it a case of empowering them to say, you know, it's okay for me to be different, and that will help the overwhelm?
I'm reminded of something Dr. Naomi Fisher said, and I'm very cautious about equipping the children. Yes, I agree. All children, we school all children, whether we like it or not, we do as parents. We teach them stuff. I think when we look at equipping children, getting them used to something that they perhaps don't like, and we all have to do things we don't like. Yes, I appreciate that. We run the risk of embedding trauma. So from my perspective is, when you're a child, if you find something difficult, you might want to have a bit of practice at it until you master it. Yeah, so you get to mastery. We learn how to read, we learn how to write. I'm not saying we don't do those things, but when it comes to the sensory environment and the bit of the world where, let's face it, if you didn't do it, it's not a big deal. So I'll give you two examples. When my son was younger, we lived in Australia, and he grew up there, and it was barring a few things like the sort of Coke bottle incident I told you about, it was pretty idyllic for him. And it was fairly straightforward. School was great and all the rest of it. But there were two things that he struggled with. One was water, and the other one was sensory overload at the cinema and things breaking. And his first experience of the cinema, the movie broke down. And it was a Thomas the Tank movie. And it took us 5 or 6 years, maybe, of slow exposure to get him back into a movie theatre. And he didn't like water. He used to love to swim in England before we left. He was a baby, but he had a slight scare in my relative's pool. It wasn't unsafe. He just got splashed, but he inhaled at the same time, and it scared him. And a lot of our children are what they call one trial learners. So if the first experience they have of something is really poor, that's it. It becomes aversive, and getting them to then experience it again is really difficult. So whenever we introduced something new, we would always say, right, we have to make sure it's a positive experience so that he's got something to anchor to. And as he's got older, he's learned that, okay, if something doesn't work the first time, you try again. But when he was very young, that was not the case. So I remember, teaching him to ride a bike and saying to my husband, don't let go of his seat, don't let him fall off. He's got to have a positive experience. And we both agreed on that. So when it comes to equipping children, there are certain things that are absolutely important. So I persisted with the swimming, largely because in Australia, if you don't swim, you're likely drown. And there were, every day, with so many pools in backyards and things like that, every day we were hearing about children, and a lot of them were autistic because they would wander, and water is attractive to children. Even if they can't swim and they're afraid of it, they're still attracted to it. And drownings were common. So it was a life skill. We knew we had to persist with that. And we did a very, very gentle, on his terms, graded exposure to that, I guess you could call it. And it was a long, long process. And now he swims like a fish, and he sails, and he's a sailor, and it's opened a whole new world of friendships and activity that he would otherwise not have had access to. So I'm really glad I pushed that. I'm not so glad I pushed with the movies, although now he does attend the movies with some university friends, and so that probably was a good thing. But I actually feel like I probably could have waited for that, but it was a social. It was an area where he might have lost social activity. Another thing is, there's certain things he didn't like to eat. He ate 4 things for about 2 years. He had very, very high sensitivity to certain foods, and there were only 4 things that he would eat. And I knew I had to, for his sake of his health, develop a palate on him. So I used a certain amount of graded hierarchy for that as well. and sort of just gently exposing to new things and trying to make them positive. So yeah, I think equipping our children for certain things is important when they are life important things. However, I listened to Naomi Fisher, and I will share the link with you later on if you want to share it with your group. But she had concerns about the way it's being used in schools. We have to equip children. We have to use graded exposure as a therapy for anxiety. So basically, the more you get used to it, the more you do it, the more you'll get used to it. And it's based on the idea, and I'll just read this out to you, that when we're anxious about something, we tend to avoid it, which is very true. And therefore, we do not get the chance to discover that it's not as scary as we think it is. Okay, that's the basis of this, this conclusion. And it gently and gradually increases the amount of exposure to the feared situation and the idea that the person becomes less fearful. Now, this works well on things like getting back into, driving after a car accident, or phobias of flying or spiders or things like that. And it's even been used with fears of things like balloons and baked beans, she says. But at no point in this therapy is the person forced to confront the things that make them scared. Okay, so my son had a fear of dogs after a friend's dog bit him on the nose, just very gently as a nip play, but it was enough to scare him because he was only little. I did not take him to the pound and put a dog in front of him, but I had to stop him, seeing a dog in the distance, and at 5 years old, running straight across a main road to get away from one. I had to stop that happening. So in exposure therapy, the person is always in control, and that's what makes it less scary. But I'm not going to, she said, I'm not going to force someone to confront their fear of driving on motorways, example. If they think it's a problem, then they're the ones that will decide on it. And that's the problem with exposure therapy, is we don't give choice. So we don't have a lot of choice with that. So with children, there's a danger that we start to define all of their preferences, and I'm talking preferences now, and bearing in mind autistic children might have different preferences, and we frame those preferences as anxiety. And that's our way of getting them to do what we want to do, which is basically just a way of compliance. So the children that don't want to go to school due to anxiety, we must then expose them to the thing that they're afraid of. But, and this is really important, anxiety is not the only reason why a person might not want to do something. So, for example, Naomi Fisher, she hates roller coasters, okay? They make her feel physically sick, and she vomits. Simple as that. So very quickly, even little tiny ones, she realized that they weren't for her. So she would avoid them. So she says, well, I think this is quite funny. Let's say I meet a therapist who tells me that my feelings on roller coasters are due to anxiety, and that my avoidance of them is making the problem worse. Let's say this therapist tells me the only cure for me is to do a graded hierarchy of roller coasters, and I don't have a choice about that. First, I'll go and look at a roller coaster, then I'll sit in one, then I'll ride a small one, lastly, I'll ride a big one. And then I mustn't stop riding them, otherwise, and I must do it every day, otherwise I'll get more anxious again. Now, immediately, as a person, you're going to start to feel anxious. And she'd start to dread that awful sick feeling about getting on a roller coaster. And she would see the years out in front of me with roller coaster rides every day. Now, apply this to children going to school. And she'd find it hard to sleep at night for fear of the roller coaster the next day. And every morning she'd get up worried about the roller coaster. I'm pretty sure that the sickness wouldn't stop, because she gets motion sick in other places too. So pretty soon she'd start to have a full-blown phobia of roller coasters. I hope this is making sense. And she'd also then have a phobia of the therapist who was making her do it. And she'd start to feel ashamed of her reactions and start to be angry with the person who was making her do this. And then she'd start to doubt herself. And maybe it's all her fault. And then her self-esteem would drop, because no one else seems to have a problem with roller coasters. So maybe there's something wrong with her. So the way she feels on a roller coaster, that motion sickness, isn't going to change, because the root cause of it wasn't anxiety, but it was framed as that because other people wanted to gain compliance for her to actually do it. So if you apply that to school, do you see where I'm going with this?
I completely do. And actually, I did a podcast with Naomi a few weeks ago on how anxiety is inbuilt in the school system. And it was very interesting and very thought-provoking. The whole metaphor of the roller coaster was very interesting to me, because what I think you're saying is that the child doesn't want to go to school, they're extremely scared of it. They then resent the parent who's making them go, they resent the school experience, and they end up with phobias about everything, right? They're phobic to the parent, they're phobic to the school system, they're phobic to everything. Now, luckily in home education, we don't put our child into school, but we do want to allow them to navigate the wider world when they're older in a way that will maximize their integration and happiness. So Diane, as an example, Diane, you're a parent of an autistic child. Now, I'm sure that you want her to be able to integrate in such a way when she's older that she can navigate the social world around her to get the very best of it. So at what point do you stop honoring her preferences and start trying to get her to adapt?
Well, I think for me, it's about balance. So I think you're right. I think we all have to equip ourselves to live in the contemporary world that we live in. But I think there is still something about the social model, if you like, which would lean towards actually society has to flex and adapt a little bit more to the needs of the individual. So if that means Rosa needs to go and get a job and she needs to choose her employer wisely, because that employer will actually understand that actually if she has a lot of human interaction in her day, she's probably going to need a break after doing that. So I suppose what I'm saying is it's for me, it's about, yes, learning to adapt and learning to have equip yourself, but also having the expectation that actually you're a unique individual with unique needs, and actually other things also have to adapt to you. So I guess that would be my view. So, as Tara says, it's about playing to strengths, I think, as well, isn't it? And about not doing, actually, why should she, Rosa hates, I don't know, big crowds, big cities, discos, all of that kind of stuff, So we do, so we occasionally, take her to London or something like that. But if she doesn't want to do that, there's no reason in the world she has to do that. She can probably navigate her life reasonably successfully without ever having to do many of the things that she despises. And, I think that's absolutely fine.
I agree with that. I mean, there are so many things in this world that we as a family just choose not to do because it doesn't suit us. So navigation is great if it's a life skill that's essential. But it isn't essential that young people learn how to tolerate loud music so they can go to a nightclub. Plenty of people get through life quite successfully without ever setting foot inside one. And it's not essential that young people learn to tolerate sensory environments, because we don't even have to go to the supermarket anymore. You can have your groceries delivered. You don't have to have go out in crowds. There are, very rarely do we, when we have to go shopping, tend to go about 3:00 on a Sunday when things are quite quiet. And that's our choice, because we don't like crowds. None of us do. We find it quite overwhelming, and then we can't do what we want to do anyway. I think it's important that we don't mix up choice and, like you said, honouring preferences with not seeing any way around it. Because often we say, oh, we've got to equip them for this. Well, hang on a minute. Can we do this thing that you're talking about somehow differently? And if we can, and it suits the person better, then why do we have to put them through the torture of this graded exposure experience? I think we have to be very careful about how much exposure kind of therapy, I guess, we do with young people, because actually we run the risk of embedding further anxiety.
I've not heard of graded exposure, but it sounds pretty horrific.
No, it's not. It's actually it's a very helpful therapy. It can be if it's done right. But with graded exposure, you would never put the person in front of the thing they fear the most. But we do this with children. I use the school environment as an example. We do, children who are autistic tend to be more sensorially sensitive. So, or opposite, they can be sensorially insensitive, where they have a less, a more muted experience, which can also bring difficulty. And if you're trying to navigate that because your experience of the world is so different to those around you, that's exhausting. No amount, if that's innate in you, no amount of exposure. It's a bit like Naomi and her roller coaster giving her motion sickness. No amount of exposure is going to make the sensory experience you have any different. It's going to be the same every single day. You might develop strategies to help you get through the day, but it will not be without cost to you. So actually what we need to do is look at what environments suit autistic people, because very often, I remember when we went to school, my son actually did go through the education system, but not without cost to him. And he, I remember going and talking to the teacher and making some suggestions about things. And I gave her a few suggestions that she could use in the classroom. And she wanted to get on top of the fact that my son would call out, because he was very, very smart, very academic, and he always knew the answer. And he used to get fed up with waiting for the other kids to answer the questions. And I kind of understand that, So he would just go, and he would say the answer. So she wanted to stop him doing this calling out mid-sentence when she was talking. So it was just a simple thing that we put a symbol on the board. And when she took it off, it was a free-for-all. And she called me in later and she said, my goodness, what a difference. So I said, what? She said, not just for your son, but actually the whole class did better, because she did it as a whole class approach. She was a very, very smart lady. And she said the whole class reacted differently. And every intervention, every suggestion, every support that we put in place, that we did as a whole class, impacted the whole class. And actually the whole class did better. But we don't do this. We tend to focus on the child who's autistic, but actually they're just the beacon. They're just the litmus paper for all of the, for the actually the benefits that it would bring to the non-autistic children too. So, but I think we forget that. We overlook it and we think, oh, we're doing this for the autistic child.
What about children with ADHD, for example? That must be quite difficult, because that is sort of like, they have really quite different needs to autistic children. So, I mean, I always think, because I trained as a teacher, and I always think it must be exceptionally difficult to accommodate the whole sort of gamut of neurodiversity, because you've got ADHD children that really don't like sort of like things to be very structured and ordered and rules. They don't like that. They like big picture. They like creativity. Then you've got autistic children who prefer things. They want to know what's happening. They, all that. Then you have all the children in between that also have all their own preferences. So I find it kind of hard to believe that you could put measures in place that would be great for autistic children, but also great for ADHD children.
So I remember growing up, like I said, I went to school in the 70s and the 80s. Before the days of national curriculum, before the days of SATs, the only exam we had in primary school was an 11+ if you wanted to do it, if you wanted to go to grammar school. But other than that, it was pretty easy going. There was no bandings of schools. There was no, I will get to the point. There was no data-driven education system at that point. Okay, so there was no Ofsted reports and stuff like that. So schools were not afraid in those days. Now, they also weren't as understanding either. However, I do remember being in a classroom, and I do remember growing up with other young people who were quite clearly, when I reflect on it, autistic or with ADHD. And I was probably one of those, because I was always allowed to do things my way. I was allowed to, this is what we're going to work on. How are you going to approach it? There was topic based, things were, so we would all find that our because we weren't aiming we were aiming towards a learning experience, as opposed to, and in the acquisition of knowledge in a way that we could acquire it, as opposed to, this is how I'm going to teach it, this cookie cutter education system, bums on seats, sitting in a row, which actually stems from preparing children for factory work. I mean, that's where it comes from. I remember being much more free range. I remember being more creative and being allowed to do so. And the school were not afraid to allow that to happen and allow that creativity to sort of come out in whichever way they wanted, because they weren't being assessed on anything. Now, what we've got now is we've got basically a school that is supposed to provide a differentiated education for each individual child's needs, and teachers who are supposed to be, all teachers are teachers of SEN, supposedly. And they're supposed to deliver this all the time and still make sure that every child knows everything for the SATs paper, teach to the test, make sure that their attendance is high, all of these different markers. And it sits in direct opposition with the kind of more naturalistic learning that young children should be doing. And I'm saying young children because early childhood is my area more, but even right up to the end of primary school, it should be more free form. There should be more opportunity for young children to perhaps self-direct a little bit with the scaffolding of the more knowledgeable teacher. It's my opinion. It's governed by understanding of development, but it's my opinion. And there are probably people out there who go, no, you have to stick to the rules, blah, blah, blah. I don't believe in it.
I guess in the home education world, I think you'd find a lot of parents would buy into that very much. And I guess that's the advantage of home education is actually you can work to your individual child or children much more freely, perhaps.
The problem is, developmentally, I think of my sons growing up in Australia, and developmentally, they don't go to school. Year one doesn't start until they're 6.5. And even that's a little bit early. But the rest of the time, it's all about play. They do have places in school that they can go, but it's not compulsory, and they can come and go as they please. Nobody's taking attendance. It's all fine. And it's all based around play, learning, interaction, social development. But so 6.5, that's when you start school. And that's when your bum is on a seat. Children up to that age, and probably really nearer 7 and 8, if I'm honest, the way that they are developing, and it'll be earlier for some and later for others, because all children are very different. But they need that extra time. They should not be sat at 4.5 years old, cross-legged on the floor, learning phonics. Okay, they should be exploring, taking risks. I remember the school teacher, the school head, said to me when my son was in what they call pre-primary, which would have been like a so it would have been about age 5.5. So I don't know what year one here. She said, we pride ourselves on how many scraped knees, occasional sprained ankle. If they're taking risks, and obviously nothing dangerous, but if they're taking risks and learning about their bodies and learning about what they can do, that is the measure of good early learning. Allowing them that freedom to do that. We don't do that. We don't do that here.
I mean, that's the measure of good learning at any age, isn't it? In the home education world, there is a really interesting perspective that play-based learning, autonomous learning, is learning that should be throughout the entire age ranges, all the way up to sort of university and beyond. And I think there's a sort of inclination amongst the school system, but also education sort of experts, that they're being very radical and exciting by sort of thinking we should all be play-based up to age 11. Then at age 11, we should all just sit at desks and do the GCSE curriculum, which is kind of depressing. However, realistically, I think when it comes to the school system, everyone listening to this is basically going to have opted out of it, or be going to opt out of it, or already be aware of the major issues within the school system. And I actually recorded a podcast with a teacher who's become a tutor, and we were talking about she was talking about the crisis in the education system, not just amongst the children, but amongst the teachers, and how there is just a mass exodus of teachers from our education system. So there's no doubt that it is reaching a crisis point, whether you're a parent, a child, or a teacher. One thing I wanted to ask you, Tara, is a number of times you've mentioned that perhaps you weren't diagnosed as neurodivergent when you were younger, but now you can see that you were. And I think you both mentioned that you are sort of neurodivergent families. Now, I believed, and I may be completely wrong about this, but I thought that autism was a neurological condition where they've actually mapped it in the brain. They know where it is. They know what it is. Oh, right, you're shaking your head. I'm glad about that, because that means that I'm wrong. Because I did think, how can that be if it's all? It also sounds like it may be genetic, because there seems to be a lot of elements of this kind of generational autism. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that. I'm guessing it isn't neurological. Is it genetic? And also you mentioned that there's a lot of gut issues. Is it something else then?
Okay, so first of all, I want to tell you I'm not a medical person. Okay, I teach this stuff at university level, but it's my background is development. Okay, so I have a background in psychology and early child development, but I am not a medic. However, I also do a lot of research. What we know about autism is, yes, we have seen some differences in brain architecture, let's say, but everyone will be slightly different. We cannot at the moment map. They've done gene testing, they've done brain architectural testing. We cannot map this to a particular gene, to a particular chromosome. We just can't. We just don't have that information yet. There's no absolute knowledge of, right, that is what autism is, and that's where it comes from. It was thought that autism was an anomaly. However, the more we're looking at it, the more we are seeing parents gain diagnoses off the back of understanding their children better. And it is not, and I stress not, a bandwagon effect. It is a slow realization and a synthesis of information of their own experiences that switches on a light and goes, ah. Does that make sense?
Yes, but could I come back and ask you a question about the whole bandwagon thing?
Yeah.
Because that is a really common thing that I hear amongst neurotypical people, is that there's this sense that I hear this a lot, which is that we're all a bit autistic. You know, like pretty much if you ask the right questions of anybody, we could all be diagnosed with autism. We could all be simultaneously diagnosed as ADHD. And I wonder, like you say, it's definitely not them jumping on the bandwagon. How do you know it's not that? Because a lot of people think that it is that.
And you have to be mindful that a lot of a lot of diagnoses are subjective, based on the clinician that you're talking to. So you can go to one clinician who will go, no, I think, looking at, they'll do, and I mean, the diagnostic process, if it's done properly, and I have to say a lot of diagnoses are perhaps not done as thoroughly as they should be, but if done properly, a threshold is reached. And, the autistic community will tell you that you're either autistic or you're not. And there is no case of we're all a little bit autistic. It's a bit like saying we were a little bit pregnant. It's
yeah, but it isn't, is it? Because in order to be pregnant, you have like there's actual things in your body. Now you've said obviously that there aren't. So if you don't know what it is and where it is, like it's really difficult to be sort of categorical, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's a minefield. And I sit permanently, and I mean permanently, on the fence with this because I don't have enough information. Nobody does at this stage to be able to say one way or the other. But currently how we do it is there is a diagnostic threshold, and a clinician makes the decision as to whether or not you are autistic or you have ADHD. And it's based on a history. It's, for adults, it's taking a very, very detailed history of their early years. It usually goes into if parents are around or siblings can contribute as well. There's a lot of information that's taken, and then it's sort of obviously looked at how you sort of function, I guess, in life today. So diagnoses are really, really subjective, and you can go to one person who will tell you you're autistic or you have ADHD, and another person will go, well, I think you're sub-threshold, but there are perhaps some traits that that you carry, but that does not make you autistic or make you have ADHD. So it is a medicalized threshold diagnosis. That's the best I can say in terms of that. And I'm sure there are other people out there and go, well, hang on a minute. We could look at it a different way, and there's a multitude of ways of looking at it. But a lot of families will recognize in themselves, okay, so this explains a lot about my childhood. This explains a lot about the way I navigate life, and it's a learning process. We're all learning all the time, and that's and we should be. And I think from that respect, that's why we see a lot of self-diagnosis in which people who cannot be bothered to go down the formalized diagnosis road, and why would they when the wait years run into years, wait list runs into years. And if they want to do it privately, it will cost them thousands if they want to do it properly. So people self-identify, I think is the word the community prefers to use.
How helpful do you think labels are? Because in the and diagnoses and labels, because in the home education world, I can safely say, having spent many years in the home education world, I can safely say it splits into two camps. You have one camp that feels very empowered by labels, very so joins the clubs, joins the Facebook groups, identifies very much with the labels. I'm a parent of an autistic child, polices language, holds on to the identity very, very closely. And then you have, I would say, the other half, which don't like labels, don't see the point of them, think it's a way of sort of being forced to conform, noticing the deficits, as you say, society just not accepting individuality, that kind of thing. And I actually have friends on both sides, and I've met lots of people from both sides in the home ed world, and it's very level pegging, like a lot of the arguments are very convincing on both sides, and yet they are diametrically different. One thinks you should never diagnose and label because it's unhelpful and it's divisive. One thinks you should definitely diagnose and label because it empowers and it allows individual identity. So
there's a couple of schools of thought, and again, this is another reason why I sit firmly on the fence with this, and largely because it's contextually driven. So there are some aspects where a label is critical, and there are other aspects where a label is absolutely devastating. So a label can be both empowering and it can be limiting, and it depends on the context which the label is used. And that's the best I can say. Well, there is a quote that autistic groups who do like labels, because actually it's part of their identity, a bit like being brown-eyed or left-handed, or, it's a facet. It's not a totalizing label. It's part of who they are. And it says, why do you need a label? And the answer comes back is, because there is comfort in knowing that you are a normal zebra and not a strange horse. Because you can't find community with other zebras if you don't know you belong. And because it is impossible for a zebra to be happy or healthy, spending its life feeling like a failed horse. Now, that's a quote from one of the autistic groups who, and I was rapidly looking through it when you were starting to ask me the question, because I can never remember it. It's a really good example of why the autistic community have chosen to own the label. They've taken it back because it's been used in, it's deficit laden, and they've actually taken it back and owned it. It's a bit like the LGBTQ plus community re-owning queer. It's really important, because actually it provides them with part of their identity, and it allows other people to understand a little bit. On the flip side, you've also got attitudinal problems with people going, autistic, right, that means you're going to do this, and this, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and you're too hard work, and put you in the too hard basket, and you're never going to amount to anything and have no aspirations. So that can be the other side of it, and that happens from school right through to employment. So life chances are limited and things like that. So I think the autistic community are getting wise, and I think they are choosing carefully where and when they disclose, that they're autistic. So I think labels are a double-edged sword, and that is my philosophical position on that. I'm sorry, it's not really answering the question.
I think the negative aspect that you had for labels was other people's reaction to the labels, but there are definitely people that I know that just don't agree with labels as a thing. They don't think that people should be labeled, because by labeling you are emphasizing the difference. And also, why do you need a label when you're just you? So Diane, I wondered for you, did you find that labels were particularly helpful, diagnoses and labels were particularly helpful in the school system? And have you found that they've lessened in their importance since you left the school system? Or are you still like a diagnosis label girl, or are you on the fence, or where do you fit?
Well, for me, it's just about whether that label is going to be helpful. So I'm a pragmatist. So I don't sit on any particular ideological part of any of it. I'm a real pragmatist. I will do whatever is helpful. So for Rosa, a diagnosis, it became clear that a diagnosis would be helpful to get her some additional support. So for instance, the age she is now, Rosa will need additional time in exams because she can't think under pressure. So she will need some additional time. One of the ways to get that additional time is to have a diagnosis. So for her, it's helpful in that sense. But for the likes of me, so I could probably quite easily go and get an ADHD diagnosis. So I recognise that I have lots of ADHD traits. But for me, there's no reason to do it because I run my own business. I've learnt to play to my strengths. I've set my entire life up so that it leans into my kind of ADHD traits rather than trying to fight against it. So for me, a label is not helpful to me. It's neither here nor there. So for me, it's an entirely pragmatic decision rather than ideological.
And I think that's exactly what parents who don't like labels would say, is that they would say that the school system and the system when you're young forces you into labels in order to get access arrangements and to navigate the school system. And that's not allowing the child to then make their decision. So a lot of people say, I'm not going to label them, I'm not going to diagnose them. When they're older, if they want that and they feel that can be helpful, then they can do that then. So I think that's probably what they would say is that by playing into the system, you're forcing your child to adopt a labelled identity that they may not want. Have you found that Rosa finds it an empowering label?
Speaking for her kind of personally, she has found it very helpful. And I think just in terms of understanding herself rather than anything else and being able to have some context around why she can be quite different to other girls her age, for instance, So she has found it really helpful. But I can see that other children may not have that response to it. And I suppose for me is that because we're not all at the same level, are we? So for me, it's about my daughter without that label would be disadvantaged in the system as it exists. So I guess what I'm trying to do is just level that up a little bit and give her the additional support because we're not all at the same place, So I don't want her to be disadvantaged by something other people cannot notice in her. So therefore, the label has become useful. But I recognise that labels are problematic. I mean, I work in criminal justice and people are labelled left, right and centre, and generally it's really unhelpful.
So I suppose a lot of it is how much control you have over the process of the labelling and the diagnosis.
Rosa used to talk about herself having special abilities, and she does. She has special abilities. She is really gifted in particular areas, and I've read some stuff about autism as being the next kind of phase of evolution, and I agree with Tara that actually, we desperately need autistic people to come up with the ideas and to pay attention to the detail and to do all the kind of good stuff that we need them to do, Yeah, so I think it's about how things are framed, and if you are framing things in a deficit model or in a deficit framework, then that's not particularly helpful. But actually, if you're framing things as a way of this is how you can understand yourself and where how you are in the world, and this might help you to do that, then I think it comes from a slightly different place.
I read an interesting analogy, which was that if you're sort of like at a board table, like a board meeting table, you need some people with dyslexia and ADHD to have the big ideas, then you need people with autism to get into the detail, and then you need everyone else to implement it. And I think that is such an important way of looking at it, that actually as a society, we have functioned very well with all these different types of people without having to put labels on it. It's just that we sort of like, I feel like we're kind of in a label world at the moment where everyone, I mean, Tara, for example, you have your pronouns here on the screen. Our listeners can't see that, but you've got your pronouns, she, her on the screen. And we're all very keen to make sure that our identities are visible and labeled. And I wonder whether there's an element that autism and other neurodivergent conditions are being swept along in this kind of need to be identified and labeled.
It's really interesting. I mean, in so many cases, I'm not a fan of labels. I think about, we talk about sort of placing labels on our children and then not giving them choice. That's a really good point. However, labels can be rescinded at any time. So, and as an adult, you can choose to engage with it or not. There's no law that says you've got to, you've got to tell people you're autistic. And you could easily, most adult autistics could choose to just drop the use of the label and just carry on. But I think in terms of labeling, we as human beings we have this need to compartmentalize things. To that's the way we process, whether you're autistic or not. We do tend to put things in categories and boxes, and we do like that. I personally would love to the world needs all kinds of minds, and without it, like you said, you wouldn't have that board table success. You look at very successful organizations now actively recruit neurodivergent people because they see the benefits of having that amount of difference in the in the company.
That actually leads me on to my next question, I suppose, which is that you've got your pronouns here on the screen now. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a point, and a helpful point, at which we would have, for example, your name and autistic next to it, your name and ADHD next to it, my name and neurotypical next to it, for example? Do you think that that's something that actually we're building up to that might be quite helpful, because it would allow companies to think, okay, this is a person with these talents, or is that actually just reducing people to like a generic idea of a stereotype?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because actually, what are we doing? Are we activating bias in people if we do that? I have my pronouns because it's required, and it's I don't really care who someone is, but I don't want to offend someone if they choose to have, if it's not visibly obvious to me. I don't want to offend someone by saying yes, he said, when actually it should be she, or vice versa. I want to respect, I guess, the perspective of whoever I'm with. And
I've got a sorry to interrupt, because I've got a very interesting segue from that, which is that I know a couple of autistic children, and they absolutely refuse to use pronouns in that way. Because the whole truth saying thing that you were saying about, they actually would prefer to use the pronoun it, because as far as they're concerned, that is the more that's the more kind of real pronoun. If they're neither, they should be it. Now, that causes a lot of aggravation, as you can imagine. Now, this brings us back, I suppose, to this idea of at what point do we police our own speak in order not to upset other people? And at what point is that then forcing conformity and masking on our children?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an evolving question, and not one that I have an answer to, because it's still very current. These are the things that we're grappling with every day.
I suppose what I'm saying is that in a world where we are increasingly taught that we need to respect other people, and rightly so, and think about how we interact with them, and there is fluidity about how people present themselves and that kind of thing, it must be difficult for autistic children to navigate that, because it isn't black and white, and we live in a world of increasingly nuanced shades of grey.
But not all children who are autistic are black and white, and is they don't always think in those dichotomous ways.
But the ones that do, for example,
yeah, and I think, but they might on certain things, and I think it's very dangerous to say that they think about things like that in that sort of black or white way in everything. It might just be in one subject. They might have a very strong opinion in one particular subject, but actually appear more fluid in other things. It depends. Again, it's contextual. It's interesting that we have this conversation about he or she, or as you said, that the young people would prefer it, where autistic people are actually overrepresented in ratio in the LGBTQI plus, I can never remember all the letters, sorry, community. So we have more, and I think it was Wen Lawson who said, actually, the reason why it doesn't bother us as adults quite so much is because we don't get bogged down in the sort of stuff that's just irrelevant. It's more about the person than it is what gender they adopt. So they see past that. You then got to look at the children and think, well, maybe it's when I'm being controversial here, maybe it's what we're instilling in them that's making them rule governed in this way. Maybe if we were more flexible in our thinking, that would instill, a bit of flexibility as well. Maybe they've been taught through school, boys go in this toilet, girls go in this toilet. It's ingrained in us from the day we start to socialize outside of the family home. Maybe that's a societal problem.
That brings us very nicely back to the idea, the benefits of home education, because of course you can control the sort of the influences that your child receives, and they don't go to school and have these very gender normative sort of experiences, and that is one of the bonuses. Diane?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Tara, we were talking about kind of cultural norms. I just wondered if there was anything to notice in terms of autism, and maybe about diagnosis, but maybe about other things that is culturally specific, what we notice in the Western world to maybe what we notice in other parts of the world, and what your understanding is of that.
So it's funny you should mention that. I remember years ago when my son was very young, we went to see a paediatrician after diagnosis, and it was just a routine meeting, and we didn't see our usual paediatrician. We actually ended up seeing someone else, and this chap engaged with my son, and they were talking and interacting, and he was only about 4, and he spent about an hour with him. And I just sat there, I just let them go. And he turned around to his desk, and he just put one hand on my son's head, or like crowned his head. And he looked straight at me, straight in the face, and he said, "In my country, he would be a great thinker." And I'll never forget that. And this chap was from Sri Lanka. And I look at things like the need for eye contact is culturally different in different countries.
Yeah.
If you go to Japan, children are discouraged from having eye contact, and most people probably know that. That's probably, that's very common knowledge, because it's seen as a sign of disrespect. What's to say what's right and what's not right? And yes, there are cultural differences, Diane, and I'm not worldly enough, unfortunately, to know too much about it. What I do know is in countries like New Zealand and Australia, they didn't even have a word for autism. They do now, and it's I think it's Waki Tankawa, or I can't remember now. I'll have to look it up. I'll find it. It's got but it just means in their own time and space.
Oh, I think I've read that. Yeah.
And it's a lovely, and I remember seeing a couple of Indigenous Australian children playing and talking to their families, and we lived slightly on the edge of the bush, and I remember looking at this child who was spinning and engaging with the trees and just playing with nature and being completely unencumbered by anything else, no school or, no formalized school anyway. They had plenty of education. And I remember talking to one of the elders about this, and said, "Do you worry about the future?" And they said, "No, because, this child is everyone's business. And we will all see to this child's needs. And whatever that child needed, the village, if you like, the village responded to that. And that child was free to be who they were. And it was a beautiful bit of education for me. And it was only the closer the Indigenous community got to Westernized living, the more anxiety was provoked in families as they were made to feel like their child was broken.
I think a lot of that as well. I would say, people listening will be like, "Well, that's all well and good, but I don't live in a tribe." But one thing I would say is that from the home education perspective, I think the home education world is a village in that way, because my children have been brought up and raised in home education, and they've never had any exposure to any kind of negative pushback about neurodivergent children. They've met many of them, and there's never been any pushback. And actually, I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, but my daughter went to an after-school club about a year ago, and we didn't have a lot of clubs where we mix with school children and home ed children. And she actually heard for the first time in her life, she was 14, she heard for the first time in her life somebody sort of taking the mickey out of an autistic child and using it as a derogatory term. She had never heard it. She got in the car with me. She cried for half an hour. She had never been exposed to it. And I think the home ed world is a village in that way. And we don't, if anyone's listening and maybe their child is still in school, I would say, like, when you enter the home ed world, obviously communities are different all over, but I have never experienced any negativity about any kind of neurodivergent child ever in the home ed world.
It sounds to me like the prejudice just isn't there. And that's exactly, let's call it out what it is. It is prejudice. It is discrimination. It is the unwillingness to adopt somebody else's perspective. When you talk about lack of empathy, if anybody's got a lack of empathy, it's the non-autistic population. Let me just say, let me come back to the empathy thing, because I've wanted to say it for about an hour. Autistic people have empathy in spades. In fact, largely they have, it was a misunderstanding, and it is an actual myth that autistic people don't have empathy. I mean, they just have a lot more emotional empathy rather than the cognitive or compassionate empathy that we would expect with a level of maturity. They physically feel other people's feelings. I remember taking my son to school and saying to them, if his mate gets hurt, because they were saying, he was attention seeking. No, if his mate gets hurt and he cries, it's because he doesn't know what to do with those overwhelming emotions that he feels for his friend. And you need to understand that he is experiencing the pain of someone else in an emotional way, not in a cognitive way or in a perhaps more detached, compassionate way that we understand it. Autistic people will tell you that even as adults, their emotional empathy is sometimes so overwhelming, which is why engaging with other people and having eye contact can be physically painful because they're experiencing it in others. And a friend of mine who's autistic said that's why we make poor counsellors in terms of, for non-autistic people, but actually great counsel for other autistic people.
That's certainly something that I've noticed, is that perhaps they're not so good at the kind of communicative social nicety empathy, but they feel so much empathy like inside, and they show it in so many different ways. But as a society, we've got so stuck on this idea that empathy is only shown in one way, which is like giving them a hug, giving you a cup of tea, and then like having like, oh no, how awful for you. And you may get the hug and you may get the cup of tea. You almost certainly would get the cup of tea with an autistic person, actually. But it's like we get stuck in how we think empathy should be shown. And if it's not shown in a particular way, they're not feeling it. And I mean, as a completely neurotypical family, I find that deeply frustrating that we cannot open ourselves up to all these different expressions of how people are feeling.
Absolutely. And it does show a narrowing of the range of our own emotions, as perhaps, non-autistic people, if we're not able to truly, deeply empathize in that way, it becomes superficial. It's a routine that we go through. Oh, you poor thing, cup of tea, sit down, hug. How much depth is in that? But if someone sits down and cries with me, they're feeling it. They understand me. And I think that's something we forget. So some of the perhaps neuronormative social responses could do with a little autisming up, I think.
I like that. Is that a phrase? I like that.
Yeah.
So is there anything else anyone would like to say?
I think there's just one thing I say. We've talked a lot today about autism, but we've talked about the type of autism that, that is not accompanied by perhaps a severe intellectual difficulty or an intellectual disability. We've talked about the type of autism largely about people who are likely to grow up and self-advocate. And I think, we've been very positive because I feel positive about it. And I'm reminded by a quote by Francesca Happe, who's a brilliant neuropsychologist. And she said in a conference, she said, pure autism never comes to clinic. And what she meant by that was when you strip away all of the other things that impact autistic people, whether they have whether it's an intellectual disability, whether it's social difficulties, and you just look at the preferences and the abilities of the individual, it's not problematic to them and it's not problematic to anybody else. It's only when you layer on neuronormative expectations and you layer on other co-occurring conditions such as a disability of some description, an intellectual disability, that's when difficulties start to arrive. And I think we have to be very careful not to negate the very, very real experiences of families and of individuals who have a constellation of different things that are impacting them. Because it's very easy for us to sit here and be glib and positive about autism when it's in its purest form, when we're just looking at it as a strengths-based difference. But actually, it's not always like that. And I just wanted to make a footnote of that, because there are families out there who are really doing it tough.
Yeah.
And I'm acutely aware of those.
I think that's such a valid point, because quite often in home ed Facebook groups, someone may come on and say they're really struggling with their autistic child, and they do tend to get a barrage of, it's brilliant being autistic, let them be autistic, it's brilliant. And I always feel that there must be this poor mother somewhere who gets off Facebook and feels that they've had their experience completely negated. And
yes.
I mean, I've been doing some trauma training recently, and obviously, like, when you experience shame following on from trauma, the worst thing that you can do is cognitively sort of say to them, but there's no reason why you should feel shame, because then they feel ashamed about their shame. Exactly. And it's a bit the same with that experience, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm very aware. I mean, I have I have a number of friends some of whom have quite young autistic children who are still struggling with, daily things like self-harm, headbanging, to a dangerous effect where the child needs to wear a helmet, with fecal smearing on a daily basis, with incontinence, communication that is so different and restricted that connection is really hard for families, and that is we must, and it must be hard for the child too. So, and we don't know because the connection's not there. So you live with that fear of not knowing, and there's no closure of the circle. So it's really important that we, and maybe that's a podcast for another, the other side of autism that perhaps that is less talked about, the non-speaking, the very, very different aspects of autism that can be out there. And I think we need to be honest about that as well, because that will be autism with, as opposed to just autism.
I would love to do another podcast on non-verbal autism. I think that would be brilliant, because actually that is almost unspoken of in the home ed world, and I think that's a real shame. What about conditions like Asperger's and that kind of thing? I mean, because I know that that's not a term that's used very much anymore, where does that fit into this discussion?
When they redid the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that is used for diagnostic purposes. That's the American one. We use ICD here in the UK a lot. In the DSM, there was a merging of of a lot of the different autism-related conditions. So things like PDD-NOS. So that's a pervasive development disorder not otherwise specified, which is basically where a clinician has looked at a child and decided they're not quite threshold enough for an autism diagnosis, but too many traits to warrant being ignored and as neurotypical, so being considered neurotypical. So you mustn't ignore this. There's something here, but and then there's other things like Asperger's syndrome, which has been subsumed under the autism umbrella. Now that's created quite a division within the autistic community, because there are some people who are Aspergic who wish to still identify as Asperger's, and others who are happy to be under the autism umbrella. But they basically, so what you now have is, this is when you go back to labels, you now have a label of autism, which tells you absolutely nothing about an individual person. That's where your label becomes a problem, because what are we talking about here? It becomes irrelevant. The name autism becomes completely irrelevant at that point.
Is there an argument for niching down then with the?
They've gone the other way. So they've decided to go the other way. I have no reason. I have no idea. I mean, I'm still not 100% clear if they've included RETS and childhood disintegrative disorder in there. Yeah, it's gone completely the other way. So I don't know is the answer.
Also the case that some areas will diagnose some things and some areas will subsume that under the autistic kind of label, generic label. So some areas will diagnose something like pathological demand avoidance as a standalone diagnosis, and some areas don't do that.
Clinically, PDA doesn't exist. Okay, it is a created label by the community.
But they're all created labels, aren't they?
Exactly. Because somebody somewhere in the medical world hasn't ratified it, it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but that's, clinically it doesn't exist. However, some places it's a profile under the umbrella of autism, but we're starting to realise that actually PDA can exist outside of autism. It doesn't have to go hand in hand with it. So it's a movable feast, I think, is the answer for that one. And I don't know where it's going to go next.
Is it changing very rapidly, the academic world and the scientific world around neurodivergence?
Nothing moves fast in the academic world. I think you can vouch for that, Di, can't you?
Apart from deadlines for your thesis, they move very fast.
So that's moving really quickly. Yes and no. It is changing fast within social culture. We're starting to get a lot more information and people are being a lot more open-minded. In terms of medical changes, well, the DSM updates every, 10 years or so?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not very quick. Yes, there's stuff going on in the background, even now, because there's a backlash against what they did with autism. I couldn't tell you what the next steps will be. It sometimes things seem to move quick, and other times that it's a glacial pace. It's difficult, Eleanor. I don't know. Is the answer.
Must be frustrating when you've got
frustratingly so. Yeah.
It must be really frustrating, actually. I mean, because when I was teaching like 20 years ago, Asperger's was the thing that everyone had, and then suddenly it disappeared. And I would have thought if you were someone who was sort of raised with that identity, that then have that identity taken away from you, I would think would be quite disempowering, actually. Almost like, you must spend time reconciling yourself to these labels, and then by the time you've got into your 30s and you're empowered by it, suddenly it's been taken off you. I'd be like, give it back. What about all my t-shirts that had like proud Aspie on and stuff like that, I think it's a bit crap. Anyway.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Tara. That's been such an interesting discussion today. So we really appreciate your expertise. Thank you for listening to Home Education Matters. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. Please join our Facebook group, also called Home Education Matters, and any links that we provide will be in the comment of the Facebook group.
Thanks very much. It's been lovely chatting today. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.